Business series has just been released, assessing regulations affecting domestic firms in 189 economies. It also ranks the economies in 10 areas of business regulation, such as starting a business, resolving insolvencies, and trading across borders. While joining us from Washington, D.C. is the United States is Rita Ramalho, who's the Program Manager of Global Indicators and Analysis at the World Bank. Rita, thank you so much for making the time to join us. So the World Economic, the World Bank report is out, and I think what everybody wants to know is, people who are not familiar with it already, is how does it work? How does the criteria work? What do you look at when you look at rankings for the different countries?
Thank you for having me. So we look at, as you mentioned, 10 different areas of business regulation. And basically, we just measure what are the steps, time, and cost to complete a transaction, such as starting a business, transferring property, getting an electricity connection, getting a building permit. But we also look at the law and what are good features and our good institutions in the law. For instance, having the right secured credit transactions, law, or having a credit bureau that shares credit information about potential borrowers, also having good courts that work well in terms of commercial dispute resolution, and also in terms of insolvency proceedings.
Now, Rita, tell us, these sort of criteria or these specific points that you look at, do they perhaps have different weightings? So is tax compliance, for example, more important or have a higher rating than opening a business?
Now, all the indicators are weighted equally, although we do realize that for different economies, different aspects of what we measure may be more relevant than for others. For us, it's very difficult to do it across 189 different economies and define what are the weights that are more important in one versus the other. So in a simple way of computing the rankings, we just used just a regular average where all indicators are counted the same way, but of course the data is all available and people can do different calculations, and if they feel like one indicator is more relevant than others for their particular economy, they can also measure that and see where the issues may lie.
Now, Rita, looking back at Africa, about 60%, 66% of the countries last year have already started to enact these reforms, as opposed to about 33% of them back in 2005. What sort of reforms are you seeing countries in Africa putting in place, and are you seeing that there's maybe a correlation between the ranking and economic growth of that specific country?
So actually in Africa, it's quite interesting that the areas of focus over the past 5 years, but also in general since we collect the data, have been on simplifying the process of starting a business and also on simplifying the logistical process of trading across borders. So we do see that African countries have reformed quite a lot. So as you mentioned, this year we have 2/3 of the African economies or sub-Saharan African economies making at least one reform. Over the past 5 years, so since 2009, among the 20 economies that improved the most in the areas measured in doing business, 9 of those are in sub-Saharan Africa, and in particular this year, 3 of the 10 economies that improved the most in the areas measured in doing business are also in sub-Saharan Africa, so Cote d'Ivoire, Burundi, and Rwanda. In terms of how does this link to impact on the ground, so we do have research, economic research actually done by others, some people in the World Bank, but also elsewhere, that shows there is a link between simplified processes in starting a business and firm creation, job creation. Also simplified processes, logistical processes in trade are also associated with more trade across the globe. So we do see that across the globe there is a direct impact of improving in these particular areas and economic development measures such as trade, job creation. In the particular case of Africa, I think in a way we still need to study more and actually understand exactly what are the impacts of this particular reform. So we know globally they do have an impact. In Africa, I think one should also have in consideration that doing business only measures 10 areas, and there's other areas that are important for the private sector development, such as infrastructure, macroeconomic stability, for instance, that are a bit outside of the scope of the project. So improving just in the areas measured in doing business may not be sufficient for the overall development of the country.
Now, Rita, before I let you go, we've seen Rwanda really shoot out the lights when it comes to, their ranking on the ease of doing business. And for the first time, we have been able to get data from the likes of Libya and South Sudan, who are also post-conflict countries. What can they take away in terms of what Rwanda has been able to implement that they can also do to ensure that they have the same sort of success?
I think Rwanda has had a remarkable history of doing business reforms since the inception of the project. So in fact, Rwanda is actually the country that since 2005 has improved the most in the areas measured in doing business. And you are correct, this year we're adding Libya and South Sudan. So these are countries that are just coming out or still in a conflict situation, and what can they learn from the example of Rwanda? I think there is just thinking what areas they want to focus, what are their priorities, and having a well-coordinated government in trying to accomplish those priorities. So one of the things that we see across the globe, this is not specifically on Rwanda, is for improvement in business regulation actually involves a lot of coordination across different bodies of the government. So it includes customs, taxes, but also the commercial registry, the property registry. So there's a lot of need for coordination within the government and to understand where the bottlenecks are and what are areas for improvement. So I think having that focus and prioritizing which areas they want to reform would probably be the biggest lesson learned from Rwanda.
Rita, there have been some criticisms with regards to the doing business reports. Some analysts and watchdogs have said they're putting too much emphasis when investors look at this. How much attention do they pay when they say, we're going to be starting a business, should I rather go to Burundi as opposed to Rwanda? What is your response to that? Do you think there's too much emphasis being put on these reports, and how relevant or how significant are they when investors make a decision?
So throughout the report, we're very clear that we only measure 10 areas. So there are limitations, of course, to what we measure. Nevertheless, these are important reforms, and we do know from research that this type of reform, simplifying business registration, for instance, does have positive impact on firm creation and job creation. But of course, if a country lacks in infrastructure or has low levels of skilled labor, those are also important constraints that firms have into account when deciding to expand or to invest. So one thing should not just be seen in isolation, but the overall aspects, even things that are not measured in the doing business report per se, are actually important also and should be taken into account. Just as a clarification, our focus is on domestic firms, so not necessarily on foreign investors. So when we're thinking about investors, we're thinking about the domestic, so an individual or a group of individuals that want to set up their firm or expand their business, and we're focusing on small and medium-sized firms.